I'll be introducing our first research presentation, which is by Simone Schaner. Simone is an associate professor of economics at the University of Southern California and the scientific director for gender at Inclusion Economics. Her work explores mechanisms that contribute to inefficiency and misallocation in low-income settings, with a focus on labor, financial, and healthcare markets. She is an affiliate of the Bureau of Research and Economic Analysis of Development, JPAL, and a faculty research fellow at NBER. Simone, you have 20 minutes, and we will only take one question immediately after her presentation. Any other questions will be taken in the panel discussion. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you guys so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've very much enjoyed the conversation and look forward to continuing the dialogue. I think this presentation is going to be a little bit different in that it's less about kind of interrogating and understanding causes and consequences of, women's engagement or lack thereof in the labor market. But it's really a paper about measurement and developing tools that we can use to get our heads around the problem in the first place. And I should acknowledge this is joint work with a set of wonderful Inclusion Economics affiliated co-authors, including Rahini, who is here today, as well as Erica Field, Natalia Rigol, Elena Stacy, who's a PhD student at Berkeley, and Charity Troyer-Moore. It was a real pleasure to get to go after Ashwini, in that you've already kind of seen this graph, right, which is kind of putting in a longer horizon context the decline in Indians' women's participation in labor markets. What you might notice at the end is there's sort of been this uptick, and I'm sort of personally very curious to understand, where this is going to go looking ahead. But, a point that I want to make, especially if you kind of put on the hat of a labor economist, is that, interpreting these changes and understanding what they mean for women's welfare is not at all straightforward, right? So, kind of we think about this period of decline, and then kind of rebound that actually started a little bit before COVID. You might ask yourself, okay, well, what would this mean if alongside, say a decline in labor force participation, women's leisure is increasing, right? Typically as economists, we think that, people, it's hard to imagine this as a professor. Typically we assume most people don't particularly like working, but they really enjoy relaxing. And so, maybe this is actually reflects kind of increases in welfare to women. We might think something very, very different if alongside this, women are spending increasing amounts of time on chores and unpaid work within the home, right? And so I raise this simply to point out that we can learn a lot more about what's happening within households as well as markets if we combine kind of these very commonly cited, very intensely studied trends in labor force participation with a broader understanding of how women are spending their time both inside and outside the household. And so that was kind of the starting point of our project. And doing so is actually really hard. I think we'd seen this slide earlier. There are huge gaps in time use data in India. It had been many, many years until, I think we had a survey in 2019. And that reflects the fact that it's really hard to measure time use, especially in kind of settings where you're working with lower income, lower literacy populations, right? Kind of probably the most common approach would be something that we would call an assisted diary, or what I'll refer to as the traditional approach, where you sit down with a respondent who's going to report what they did yesterday, and an enumerator is going to kind of fill out well over 100 different activity categories in 15-minute increments. And you can kind of imagine, the experience of participating in a survey like this is not particularly pleasant. It takes a lot of time. There's a lot of attention to detail. And you also really need highly skilled enumerators in order to get these classifications right. And as a result, this just is something where it costs a lot to train people, it costs a lot to implement, and it takes a lot of time, which crowds out time in the survey for other things. As a result, another thing that people sometimes do is what we would call a stylized questionnaire, where I would just sort of say, Gaurav, how much time did you spend answering emails yesterday? And he would sort of try to add it up into his head and report back, right? So, this can it has its own drawbacks. So what's good about this is it's fast, but it imposes a significant cognitive burden on the respondent, kind of especially if you're asking about sort of complicated concepts or activities. You can kind of have telescoping recall bias, right? I just sort of don't remember a lot of what I did yesterday, especially if I'm not kind of narrating my day. And it's really hard to account for multitasking within a framework like this. And there's sort of a final possibility, right, which is to literally just observe what a person is doing kind of over the course of their day and record them. But of course, this is like the most costly, most time-consuming thing. It may well be that people alter their behavior when they're under observation, right? So for better or for worse, this means that we're kind of left with a series of approaches to measure time use, none of which are great. And as a result, we really don't see, in my view, enough time use data, especially in large labor market surveys that are kind of administered at scale and repeated over time, both of which are really important, I think, for understanding some of these large shifts in labor force participation. And so the purpose of this project was really kind of to try to find a way of maybe combining some of the things that are good about those different methods I talked about, to come up with a time use module that's sort of easier and cheaper to administer, but also feasible to do at a larger scale, right? So we wanted this to kind of be low cost, scalable, appropriate for a low income, low literacy group. And we sort of came to it with our gender hats on, and so we wanted to come up with a method that would have enough nuance so that we could start to understand, sort of some of the trade-offs and patterns in women's lives around kind of leisure versus paid and unpaid work, as well as engagement in childcare. And we didn't just want to kind of come up with a new method. We wanted to understand whether or not it worked, and if so, how much better or worse it was than available alternatives. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about, is there anything that comes close to what we might think about as a gold standard in this setting, and we design a study so that we compare our new approach to that gold standard. Alongside, we want to compare this method to what I would call that traditional approach, this assisted diary approach, which is what you would see, for example, in the Indian Time Use Survey, kind of while collecting this cost data so we can report on how much money you're saving. And so the method that we came up with is what I call a hybrid approach, and that it kind of combines elements of this sort of assisted diary with sort of creation of like a smaller stylized set of time use categories. And so what we landed on is we have enumerators who sit with the respondents who go through the act of narrating their day, but instead of kind of breaking every 15 minutes into 156 categories, what we do is each enumerator has 24 physical tokens that they then allocate between 8 broad activity categories. You can see, this is, I think, a picture from our pilot. They sort of put the tokens to the different activities in front of, and with the respondent, so there's a visual representation to the person who's answering the survey about how much time they're spending. And once we're done, the enumerator kind of reviews that allocation with the respondent and says, okay, it looks like you spent 4 hours in chores, like 8 hours on sleeping, you spent an hour in work. Does this look about right to you? And then kind of adjust the token allocation if needed with the respondent. And I think a lot of the discussions earlier in the day were sort of, I think, very well timed in terms of framing some of the issues that we came up with when sort of just doing this work, and that I would say it was sort of very much a research activity where we're quantitative researchers, but we're kind of like deeply embedded in qualitative research and just like spending a lot of time talking to women to understand both, not just how they spend their day, but how they think about the activities that we're doing, right? So we kind of just started by, understanding how women are spending their time and use that information to, kind of come up with an initial set of time use categories that made sense for the group that we were studying in terms of these are broad things that people do a decent amount of time. but were also kind of relevant for our research questions and our interests. We then did a sort of small-scale pilot to crosswalk our broad categories to these sort of traditional 156, I think, categories that you would find in a standard time use survey, and then did a pilot. And one of the things that we really focused on over the course of these activities was really kind of trying to understand the nature of kind of home production and, what many women, we've already talked about this a little bit, how women think about like chores and care work, and is some of that, kind of economically productive, and also just understand where and why women's activities were performed. And so, one key takeaway that came out over the course of this, and this sort of came up in some of the discussions, including, what Mahu led at the beginning of the day, is that women actually do a lot of income-generating activities that they simply think of as chores, right? Like, I might not think that, like, caring for the water buffalo every day is an income-generating activity, but if the household is selling the milk and the produce from that, it is an economically productive activity. Which is, in a way, though, conceptually distinct from a kind of work where a woman would be explicitly paid and remunerated for the work. And so what we landed on to address for this was to kind of have separate categories for common types of work like wages, self-employment, and work on one's own field, but also record indoor and outdoor chores separately. Kind of with the idea that chores, especially performed outside, are often productive. A second takeaway that we had kind of from this process was that there's a major risk of kind of understating the amount of time that women spend caring for children, and that they'll often be minding the kids while doing something else, and this simply doesn't come up in conversation, right? And so we worked really hard to kind of develop a protocol where we're sort of constantly probing women, okay, well, while you were doing this, were you taking care of kids? Were the kids around, to make sure that we didn't miss out on this passive childcare that kind of happens simultaneously with other activities that women do. So that's kind of the broad picture of the hybrid approach. And in terms of the two other approaches that we compare it to, we have the gold standard, which I'll go through this quickly since I kind of described it already. Essentially, what we did is sort of tried to modify this idea of observing people in such a way that it wouldn't distort behavior, and that we had enumerators visit respondents for just like 2 to 3 minutes really quickly, like every hour for 10 hours a day, to record what they had done in that past hour, and map that to the more fine-grained activities that you see in the Indian time use survey. And then right before they left, they kind of said, okay, well, what are you planning on doing with the rest of your evening? And we can sort of compare that to ex-post reports on the next day. And really kind of tried to encourage respondents, over the course of this, don't distort your activities anyway. Like, if you have to go out to the field, like, we'll come find you, so on and so forth, so that we could sort of avoid some of these, Hawthorne-style effects. So, and then the third method that we're going to compare this to is just this traditional assisted diary approach. So a little bit more about the study. We sort of did this work in Gwalior district in rural, so this is a district in rural northern Madhya Pradesh. It's an area where income is low, gender norms are quite conservative. Worked in 13 gram panchayats in this area, with about, kind of 500 respondents from 200 households. And one thing that we were also really interested in doing is, I hope that maybe part of what you got from the earlier slides that I presented is there was kind of like a lot of intensive qualitative work that went into understanding women's lives and developing a set of categories that were well matched to the study population. And so one of the questions that we had in developing this is like, okay, well, like, how well does this module do, kind of maybe across a broader group of individuals at different life stages and ages. And so we formed strata, kind of by marital status, kind of unmarried, but then also over under 30, crossed by gender. So we assess how this does for both men and women, despite the fact that it was sort of a very woman-centered module in terms of its development. So just on average, like these women are relatively young, given how we form the strata. They're 30 years old. The vast majority of women, 75%, report that their main occupation is being engaged in domestic duties, very consistent with this area. In here, kind of women report about 6 hours of leisure per day. Men report 8, which is sort of consistent with gender gaps that you would see, in this study area and many other dimensions. I'll maybe just quickly put up, this is a bar graph showing how time use in our sample using that sort of assisted diary approach compares to the 2019 time use survey for rural women. It's pretty similar. Women in our sample are kind of enjoying a little bit less leisure and doing more chore work, but it's one part of India, but the way they spend their time is broadly representative of what we would see in rural areas. Okay. So in terms of the methodological approach, what we did is kind of almost like two sets of evaluations, in that we had kind of 2 visits that both tried to measure time use on a first day, which I would call reference day 1. And so on the first day, everybody got this gold standard approach where you had a numerator constantly checking in on them to sort of form this gold standard baseline. And then the next day, the enumerator came back again, and we randomly assigned each respondent to get either the traditional India time use style assisted diary or our hybrid method, asking about that previous day, right? So what that does is it lets us compare within respondent, how does either the hybrid or the traditional method compare to this gold standard that we got from observation. So we're going to use that for a lot of our comparisons, but you might worry about an approach like this because maybe the fact that I was sort of like checking up on Rolly every hour and saying, oh, what did you do last hour? What did you do last hour? What did you do last hour? She might be very good at telling me what she did the next day when I come find her. And so to kind of assess how these modules perform, outside of this particular structure, we added a third visit for a completely separate day that happened, I think, at least a week later, which we call reference day 2, where we just randomly assign each respondent to one of the 3 methods. And what that does is it'll sort of let us compare how the distribution of time use looks across methods, kind of without this day 1, day 2 priming that was sort of implicitly happening in the first 2 visits. Okay, so this is many bar graphs, kind of just sort of showing what happens in the gold standard, which is the yellow bars relative to the hybrid and traditional method on those first days. And the main takeaway here is that all of these methods are kind of delivering the same broad patterns in time use. So our assessment is that both the hybrid and the traditional method perform well relative to the gold standard. And sort of another thing that we did within this is to sort of create a more global measure of prediction error. So kind of, for those of you that care, the root mean square error relative to the gold standard day, for those who are not into stuff like that. Just think about it, we look at kind of how many mistakes are made relative to the gold standard for both methods, and we see is this higher for hybrid versus traditional. And what we find is that the hybrid method does really well for women. Like in terms of prediction error, right, the numbers are essentially the same. That's what you see in the 2 left bars there. However, for men, it underperforms a little bit, right? So while the averages that I showed you on the previous bar graph are generally look pretty good for men, the hybrid method is still kind of making more or bigger mistakes relative to the gold standard. So that's one thing. I'll get into that a little bit more in a slide or 2. The other thing that I would mention, which if you ever wanted to use this, which we hope that you will, another important limitation that you should just keep in mind is that the hybrid method is going to miss shorter duration activities, right? If you're trying to measure something that people only do for 10, 15 minutes a day, using 1-hour tokens to represent activities is not going to work well, right? And so kind of turning back to that men thing, I think the other thing we think is category selection and how you represent things really matters, right? So context is important. And that what we find is almost all of that performance difference for men is driven by unmarried men who underestimate in the hybrid method the amount of time they're spending on household chores. And we can't sort of formally test this hypothesis, but our working hypothesis, which I think is quite plausible, is that this may have been a somewhat unfortunate combination of gender norms and graphic choice, because the picture on the right-hand side is the picture that we use to represent chores when doing this token allocation, and you can see that this is a very gendered picture, right? So especially among young unmarried men, if there's a norm that I shouldn't be engaged in chores, you could see how they may be underreporting when you're sort of forced with or faced with the experience of having tokens allocated to this particular picture. So do your qualitative work carefully when you do this. I have one last minute, so I'll just maybe say the hybrid module is indeed faster and more cost-effective, so it takes significantly less time relative to the traditional method, which is what we wanted. And so to kind of maybe come back and just think about why is this important? Well, hopefully I convinced you at the beginning, time use data is just really important for understanding, what is happening, so that we can have, informed conversations about what is happening with women's labor supply. And if you're interested in kind of having a sort of a cost-effective, slightly more detailed way of capturing time relative to, say, a single stylized question, hybrid approach works well, is effective and time efficient. But take the category selection and your qualitative research really seriously if you're going to use this in the field, and be very thoughtful and intentional about it. And I will close there. Thank you so much. Liz, I'm here for exactly one question. And then I'll be back for more questions later.
Hi, I had a question on the unpaid care work that you said. So how did you sort of define, since you said that most people don't account for the passive sort of care work that they're doing. So how do you sort of explain to the respondent what you mean, and sort of how do you define this? And I think in one of the graphs you showed the active care work and passive care work. How do you distinguish between the two, and what is the approach that you used?
Okay, great. Yeah, so a lot of the work comes through the the narration of the day and careful probing. So in terms of active care work, that would come through, if it was kind of I woke up and then I gave my daughter a bath, right? The enumerator would be asking time to understand how much time the respondent was spending, doing something like that. And so that would just be active care that is part of the day narration. The way that we solved the second problem was just asking people okay, you said that you spent the past hour, kind of taking care of the cows. Were you minding your kids while you did that, right? So that's kind of accomplished by sort of this sort of constant probing that you then sort of add up this additional category, at the end, which we think is something that for our sample, it made a lot of sense to do caregiving that way. But if you were interested in any other kind of multitasking, you could think about doing it with that same approach of kind of sort of probing as someone is doing the narration.